Alright, YouTube, it's time for the Occult Video 65 on the crystal skulls, of course, these objects of legend that many people claim have certain spiritual powers. We have to look into both the case of authenticity as far as the claims of manufacture go, but we've also got to look into certain New Age arguments that are made about certain physical objects as well. The crystal skulls, there are four of them specifically that are supposedly ancient. Of course, there are plenty of crystal skulls that are openly admitted to have been manufactured in modernity. You know, for a few $100 you can get one of these chiseled out of anything from glass, certain types of stone, obsidian, certainly quartz. If you're willing to spend a little bit more, you know, rock crystal, amethyst crystal skulls, you can get them in various sizes. You're looking at quite a bit of money. If you're getting an actual quartzite crystal skull, it's actually the size of a human skull and is made halfway decently, you're looking at a lot of money potentially if you're buying one. A little glass one won't cost as much. Of course, you can get a glass orb for like, you know, 10, 20 bucks as well. That being said, the claims of authenticity of the four specific crystal skulls, there's one in the British Museum, there are others in the world. Those claims are up in the air, but presumably false. That is, they are not ancient objects. They were made in relatively modern times. We're talking about the 1800s. It's not like they're brand new objects. But upon closer analysis, it appears that they have all been machined in some way. That is, they were not formed with simple copper tools. They were not formed by taking sand and string and very slowly grinding down layer after layer of quartz. This makes sense, of course. It wouldn't make any sense from the point of view of looking at archaeology and looking at the spiritual systems of the Mesoamericans supposedly making these. It wouldn't be part of their tradition necessarily to create such objects. They wouldn't have any real intrinsic purpose. That being said, the fact that something is not authentic in the sense of being ancient, being formed by some then fabled long-lost tribe during the period of the height of the archaeological frenzy, when people were emptying out every tomb they could lay their hands on and trying to rediscover Atlantis and things like that. Just because that story happens to be false doesn't mean the objects aren't of spiritual significance to those who choose to ascribe such a thing to them. It's like with grimoires. We look at the Sworn Book of Honorius, or we look at the Sword of Moses or something. Most often, and this is most of the time the case, with grimoires especially, not so much more modern folkish works, we look at the spells or the attribution given to an older figure, like Hermes wrote this, John Dee wrote this, Roger Bacon wrote this, Nostradamus wrote this, Agrippa, Paracelsus, any of these figures, Moses or Solomon, somehow they were responsible for the manufacture of this. I can think of no better example than the fourth book of Agrippa. The fourth book of Agrippa was not written by Heinrich Cornelius Agrippa. That being said, it fits in, number one, with the tradition, so it's still valid, more or less, by somebody who is obviously familiar with the three books of occult philosophy that he did write. Number two, the ritual system given, you can't simply discount it simply because Agrippa didn't write it. Or it's like the Necronomicon, I've pointed this out, the late 70s, early 80s Necronomicon, the Simon Necronomicon, contains a realistic ritual system that calls upon authentic pagan deities within the realm of a more or less authentic paganized system. The fact that it's probably not based on some ancient tome of Sumerian lore is clear. That doesn't cheapen the work. It doesn't mean that the ritualism that is there cannot literally be used by somebody who happens to agree with that practice. If you take magic as more or less a psychological exercise, and the occult as science as yet unexplained, the fact that it is not authentic means nothing. The fact that a modern Hellenist may not be practicing the same rituals as a person who venerated Zeus or Athena 2,000 years ago does not mean that their rituals cannot work in the same way. You can, by chance alone, rediscover long-lost lore, because there are only certain numbers of gestures, words, rituals, and formulas that can possibly be cobbled together during a ritual. As such, I'm not a big fan of the purist argument of needed authenticity when we're talking about something that is quite old anyway with the crystal skulls. We're talking about the 1800s. We're not talking about it was chiseled 5 years ago in somebody's garage and they tried to pass it off as an authentic Aztec relic or something like that. We're talking about things that they date back to a highly esoteric period. You look at the Little Albert, you look at Hohmann's powwows, which I'm now finished with editing. It's from the 1820s. This is roughly the same sort of period of time during this early archaeological frenzy that follows in the wake of such discoveries as the Rosetta Stone by the French and by archaeological discoveries by the British at the height of imperialism. The fact that many of the trinkets and books and manuscripts and scrawlings and potsherds and so forth that were brought to the Western world were not authentic because archaeologists and military generals and ambassadors and all these people that poured into the ancient world were willing to pay a premium for anything that looked like it might even possibly be authentic. The fact that they were willing to do that meant that they got a lot of forgeries. This doesn't necessarily mean that outside of the archaeological perspective or the geological perspective, which might apply to something that's made out of stone, the fact that they aren't real in the sense that they're not from 1,000 years ago really becomes meaningless. You could also, in a way, even these fake relics, you could think of as authentic archaeological remains from that time period of the 1800s as well and study them thus, framing them, of course, in the situation of fake relics that were passed off as an effect, a byproduct of actual colonialism. So it's not that it's not authentic, it's just that the attribution of it as being specifically ancient is wrong. I happen to believe that crystal skulls, or anything made of crystal, is at the very least paranormally exciting to people that are into that sort of thing. Now, the importance of rock crystal being chiseled into various forms, of course, is more New Agery. You look back at the days of the Oracle at Delphi or something, you don't necessarily have crystal being applauded as much. Even just a simple stone carving out of marble or sandstone was also important. There was more importance given to the precious metals than necessarily to certain gemstones. You didn't have gem cutting back then. You didn't have a fixation upon these relatively common rock crystals that are used today. Back then, and this is something people should keep in mind when they're thinking about ancient recipes for magical crystals or whatever. Prior to the advent of gem cutting, diamonds were considered more or less worthless. The big ones were things like topaz or something like that, because the rocks were simply smoothed and polished into round shapes. And so you would get a luster from something like a sapphire or an emerald. For instance, you would look at, I believe it's called the Star of India or something. It's a giant sapphire, and it has quite a shine to it, but it's a polished cut. It's not a gem cut. It wasn't, back then they didn't have the means or necessary, they hadn't developed the concept of the gem cut yet, so you have to understand that as well. They didn't have faceting, they had polishing. This matters with regards to these things. But if you take one look at these crystal skulls under a microscope, apparently you can see evidence that they were machined. That is, that they were not manually produced. That does not mean, however, that such relics, and I think this video pertains to more than just the crystal skulls, that's just an example that I happen to be fixating on for the purposes of the video. The fact that it is not fully authentic as far as the claims of origin given at the time they were supposedly discovered doesn't mean that they can't be considered occult objects. And they're certainly archaeological objects of note regardless of their actual date of manufacture or the style they were manufactured in. That's about all. Peace out.